I was raised in the countryside. When I was a young child, I thought of it as a natural environment. I spent my formative years moving from one rural environment to another, and later understood that these landscapes, rather than being natural terrain, were perfectly manicured plantations, where varieties of sugarcane were carefully bred and planted in 5-foot by 5-foot plots in ploughed fields. 1,742 cane holes were planted per acre. There wasn't anything natural about the plantation. Since the early 17th century, this land has been deforested, mapped, farmed, and under surveillance as Britain's first sugar isle. Those actions, under the guise of empire, expansion, and progress, contributed to what is now understood as the birthplace of the Anthropocene or the Plantationocene, the era of environmental transformation and climate collapse. What was once understood as a passive space has transformed. The lands are now showing agency, rupture, and abundance. I try to listen to it with another ear, and I wonder if we listen to it more carefully, what we might hear and what we might learn about it and about ourselves. My work straddles biography and history, focusing on post-plantation economies by engaging with this particular landscape here in St. George, Barbados, where I've been located for the last 20 years. It was a former 17th century sugar plantation and converted to a dairy farm more than 35 years ago. I'm interested in drawing lines on paper, interfering with lines on ledger pages, forming lines that connect this time to that time. My practice recognizes the need to draw new lines, refusing to accept that all lines have already been drawn. The Wild Plant series acknowledges the agency of wild botanicals growing in former sugarcane fields. I once saw them as weeds, but I later understood their medicinal value. Grown and cared for by enslaved Africans, used in Afro-syncretic spiritual practices for healing, these plants shaped identity in slave societies. I now see these plants as active agents in the process of healing the soil, re-emerging centuries later to assert themselves against the backdrop of a dying sugar industry. When I walk the fields, I find porcelain and ceramic shards in the soil, which I've incorporated into the work called Bush Tea Services. And from this project, I have served bush tea made with cerci, lemongrass, blue vervain, and bay leaf, while engaging in dialogue about British-Barbadian historic relations. I was surprised when speaking with London-based participants by their lack of understanding regarding our shared history and how the landscape was transformed by the colonial project to modernize their society. How could they not recognize us after so many centuries of entanglement? Bush Tea Plots, a decolonial patch, is a permanent intervention located at the University of the West Indies in Barbados. It references small plots of land given to the enslaved people where they grew food and medicine, took care of themselves and of each other, becoming important sites of tradition, healing, and ritual. The plot was a creative pre-capitalist site located within the larger capitalist colonial machinery of the plantation. It resisted the dynamic of the plantation and became a space for the creative imaginary, the nurturing of spirit and of memory. My current commission is developing an apothecary at Walker's Reserve in St Andrew. It's located in the Scotland district. It's called the Garden of Hope, and it's located on what was the 17th century sugar plantation. It then converted about 50 years ago into another kind of extractive economy. It was a silica sand quarry, and that's now going through another transition to become a permaculture site. The Garden of Hope is dedicated to indentured women, invisible women who eked out a living in the harsh landscape of the Scotland district, as well as the women and girls who were listed in the 19th century slave registry for walkers. And that living apothecary is going to include plants that will focus on women's reproductive and post-reproductive health. It will have plants that will be used for a general first aid kit. And the apothecary will sit within the larger, hopeful vision of a post-plantation regenerative landscape.
I'm speaking to you from Walker's Dairy Farm. It was originally operational as Willoughby's sugar plantation in 1667, which was established by an Eton-educated Englishman. I'm from a small island in the Southern Caribbean called Barbados. It was Britain's first sugar isle. It's the place where the British developed their model of the sugar plantation in the British West Indies and effectively rolled it out across the archipelago. We are a small place of 21 miles long and 14 miles wide, with a population of just under 300,000 people. We became independent in 1966, so I was born as a kind of a subject of the British colony. And at the end of this month, on the 30th of November, I'm happy to share that we are becoming a republic, and we will be relinquishing the Queen of England as our head of state. So that's going to be a very kind of big moment for us. I want to now begin to address the three words. The first is turbulence, and I've been seeing, as I've been watching the COP26 remotely, there was a brief phrase: this is not climate collapse, it's colonial collapse and climate revenge. And I think that that really connects to the experience that we're having here in Barbados and the Caribbean. The ecological issues that we have today are very much rooted in our colonial history. It began with the eradication of the island's biodiversity by the British in the 17th century to make way for monocrop farming of the sugarcane plantation across the entire island. This, of course, was blessed by the Anglican churches that were established in each of the 11 parishes, worked on by indentured labourers, some of whom came from Scotland, as well as England, Wales, and Ireland. And then they were replaced in the 17th century by the labour force stolen from the continent of Africa. So these extractivist economic practices continued for centuries, and more recently, the shift from monocultural agricultural farming to a tourism-dependent economy, which maybe looks different, a little bit fancier on the outside, but there are some similarities. Today, we have a debt to GDP ratio close to 150%. It's one of the highest in the world. Like everywhere else, this has been a very turbulent year. We had COVID. Our unemployment, I believe, is now at 17%. It's had, like everywhere else, a huge impact on our economy, the health sector. Then in April, we experienced outrageous ashfall from a volcano on an island, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The La Soufrière volcano erupted about 100 miles west of us, and it dumped about 90,000 tons of ash, which forced us into another kind of lockdown. Some of us had a really kind of embodied response to that moment. I literally had to lock myself inside a closed building for 5 weeks because I had such an extreme reaction to it. We then had a Category 1 hurricane sometime after that, which caused a lot of damage. There was a small earthquake off the south of the island. And I think that we're really beginning to experience the climate crisis in a very kind of embodied way, which is sort of terrifying. 6 weeks ago, while I was still in the UK, Barbados was impacted by ashfall from a volcano in the Canary Islands, which is 3,000 miles east of us. And last week, when I was driving across the valley near to where I live, it looked like a foggy English morning. And it was just blanketed in this very fine matter from 3,000 miles away. 2021 has been the third most active hurricane season on record. It's been the fourth most costly in damage. And for the last 7 years, we've had hurricanes coming outside of the regular hurricane season. And our understanding of this is that we did not cause these problems, but we have to protect ourselves from this other kind of historic injustice that got us here. The COP26 that's currently happening, there is representation from the Caribbean, including our Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, who seems to have made some kind of waves there with her very kind of frank speaking, and putting the responsibility on the part of the industrial nations to finance the small island developing states in terms of being able to respond to these crises. For some time now, I've been exploring issues related to the history of the plantation, which has irrevocably altered our landscape. And today I want to share some artworks from some time ago and more recently. that I've made in an attempt to address the radical transformation of the land from what was an uninhabited island at the time of the arrival of the British settlers in the early 17th century. So this first piece was commissioned by the Brooklyn Museum of Art. It's called Just Beyond My Imagination. It was part of an exhibition called Infinite Island Contemporary Caribbean Art. And it kind of responds to the developer's vision of Barbados as a perfect tourist attraction. It's offering these well-packaged, exclusive golf courses. We, in 2006, hosted the Golf World Cup Championship, and there was this idea within the government that we would become an international golfing center. And this installation presents the archipelago of the Caribbean. You're seeing Belize at the far left, Cuba, and then it comes right down to Barbados and Trinidad. And what I'm trying to show is this kind of landscape that's been completely altered for tourism. The best resources go to the tourist and to the visitor, but the Caribbean Sea is kind of this, it's just a sea of grass. There's no water. Barbados is one of the most water scarce countries in the world. So it's this perfectly manicured environment. There is a small mat on entering the environment that says members preferred. So it speaks to a particular kind of exclusivity and privilege in terms of who has the capacity to consume the pleasures of these spaces. The title of the work is taken from the Barbados Board of Tourism's marketing slogan, and it used to be Barbados Just Beyond Your Imagination. And I kind of played with that a bit and changed the word to Just Beyond My Imagination, because I'm seeing a transformation in my life that's quite profound. This piece is called Sweet Island Cookie Cutters, and it also, again, is responding to the developer's vision of Barbados as this very perfect tourist attraction, offering well-packaged housing communities and developments for wealthy locals and expatriates that are often built around golf courses and polo fields. Most of the south and west coast of the island is no longer visible when you drive on the coast road, because it's just private homes with gates and upmarket hotels. And as we lose access to that coastline, we're now creating these interior landscapes for people to be able to have these upmarket housing communities. So the idea was to create these kind of upmarket cookie cutter boxes that spoke about the way in which we package our space. And when you slide open the cookie cutter, then there are these different kinds of icons: the polo player, the boat, the cocktail, etc. This next piece is, these are some stills from an 8-minute video called Public Beach Access. My entire life, I've been going to the beach, and I believe in something called saltwater healing. So I try to put my body in the Caribbean Sea at least once or twice a week. And for decades, I've been listening to Barbadians engage in very polarized discussions about the startling rate of the disappearance of what we call windows to the sea. And if you see, this is a public access beach site, and it's a very narrow kind of site, a concrete on either side, you know, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for locals to get onto the beach. I measured 7 miles of public beach access points on what's called the Platinum Coast or the Gold Coast of Barbados. There are hotels there that would rent a room for $25,000 a night plus tax, which is kind of unbelievable, but it's true. And so I measured how many feet of beach access were available to local people. In this case, Prospect Bay had 5 feet and 4 inches. And throughout the work, I'm singing the song. It's called Jack, and it was written by a Calypsonian who was challenging the Barbados Board of Tourism's legal counsel, who was trying to get hotels to be able to expand their property to down to the waterfront. I measured that we had on 7 miles, 142 feet of public beach access to local people. So we are very much experiencing our glorious coastlines in a transactional way. It's a kind of a framework of commerce. embedded in what I would call a kind of a rabid tourism. And there becomes almost nowhere for people to kind of experience the coastline outside of that. Some of these you would have seen in that short film. I kind of respond to the emergence word. I think, you know, previously when I was thinking about turbulence, that turbulence really comes out of a colonial historical context. The emergence is something I think we're kind of at now, where we're kind of developing a greater self-awareness and self-knowledge, and part of becoming a republic as a young, relatively young, almost, you know, a Black small island state is part of that emergence. And I think we're all trying to educate ourselves about things we didn't understand, or to respond to an incomplete curriculum in our educational program. So the Wild Plant series, you know, I thought about these as weeds, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I began to understand that these wild botanicals that are now resurfacing in former sugarcane fields were used by the enslaved society, where this is a place where they would become human, and these plants became part of their apothecary. They were very important plants, and there were things that were overlooked, and we didn't have knowledge or understanding of that. The wild plants are drawn on the ledger page, which is a tool of the British Empire. It's a precursor to today's accounting system, and it suggests order. In fact, there is a lot of chaos underneath of our soil. And I was trying to, since 2014, I've been working on these ledger pages, and I'm trying to insert other images and narratives to say that the economic rendering of our kind of telling of our story is incomplete, and there are other images that have value. That work then developed into Bush Tea Services. It was commissioned by Cooking Sections, and I came to London to serve bush tea. This is made from Barbadian clay. I worked with a local potter, Hamilton, Wiltshire. And these are shards that I find when I'm walking. I mentioned it in the film. They're from the late 1700s, early 1800s. They would have been produced in Derbyshire and Staffordshire, come out as ballast on ships used by the settler colonial class, and found their way into the indentured and enslaved community. So I made this tea from plants that I harvested in the fields, and rather than a tea sweetened by sugar grown on plantations, tea from Chinese plantations, it's a kind of a healing tea. It was the small act of reparation in the pop-up exhibition called the Empire Remains Shop in London. And it was really quite shocking how people that were coming in didn't have this understanding of a shared history. I would pour the tea and it would leak and drip, and it would kind of speak to the gaps in history and the incompleteness of our understanding of the shared history. And then this work is the Bush Tea Plots, which is a permanent installation at the University of the West Indies. And it's inspired by Sylvia Wynter's writing about the plot as a pre-capitalist site within the larger landscape of the colonial project in the plantation. It's where the enslaved had to plant ground provisions for sustenance and wild plants for healing, for bush tea, for bush bath, for bush medicine. So this glass vitrine, which has a QR code that takes you to a website that has a lot of kind of scholarly papers and information on the plants, is this kind of small space that speaks to the value of the plot within the context of enslaved society and how important it was for people to feel human in this context. It's where community was built and knowledge was passed on. So this is its location at our university here in Barbados. There was then a commission by Harlem Art Space in Derbyshire for an exhibition I had there last year. And that brick building was a cotton mill seated in Derbyshire, in the seat of the Industrial Revolution in England. And so I was then commissioned to produce a bush tea plot there. Barbados shipped cotton to England in the 17th century, and the cotton mill workers had a lot of illnesses. So this bush tea plot was repurposed for the Harlem Art Space Gallery, using plants that were harvested from wild botanicals in that area, but plants that had healing properties like spinner's phthisis and different bronchopulmonary issues that cotton mill workers would have had. When I think about enchantment, I think about being enchanted with ourselves and with where we are. And for me, enchantment comes through this ritual act of walking on these fields. The place I am is 120 acres and it's a working dairy farm. And I walk the fields very often. So I wanted to share a brief excerpt from a piece called How to Know a Land. It was commissioned by the curator Miguel Lopez for an exhibition that recently closed at the Kunsthalle Vienna in Vienna. And that exhibition is called And If I Dedicated My Life to One of Its Feathers. So I'm just going to read an excerpt. How might I come to know a burdened place, love a land, walk in step with sights first met through foreign measurements? How to listen with another ear, connect with grounds buried beneath ceaseless cadastrals, surveys, mappings, sweat, blood, death, and labor, as though the profound depths of any land could ever be measured or owned. How does a land grab hold of you? Coursing through these old lands at dawn is one way I have come to know this place. Measuring a less nimble aging body against this ground, I sense increasing fragility on steep inclines and hesitation in measured movements on downward slopes. The wind meets my sweating skin as I rub black sage and cerci leaves between my fingers, inhaling their sharp aromas. Later, I lean into the slender, scrambling ink vine shrub, swallowing a sweeter nectar from its fragrant white-petaled flowers. Stumbling over long grass, I clumsily regain balance, slowly bending under electric fencing in this grassy terrain now populated by heifers. This soil is a tomb, a repository of seeds, and a silent witness to an archive of lives listed without surnames. Listening to umpteen pods rattling on the woman's tongue tree, I come to rest here, to find a softer place inside and to listen. With the onset of this year's dry season and its blustery winds, I ask myself, can you know a place through its breeze? These haunted lands are the sediments of my birth. On my short walk today, I found 2 feathers while hiking through the gully that feeds into 2-acre field. A nomadic gray-tailed cockerel winds his way from the milking parlor, through the gully, back up the cart road, his feathers drifting back and forth on the gentle breeze before slowly falling to the soil. I brought them back to the studio to examine their 1,000 tiny ribs. Okay, in this 6th part, before I kind of just go through some of the images silently, they are a series of 8 drawings commissioned for the potential agrarianisms. Will there be sugar after the rebellion? This exhibition just came down a week ago at the Kunsthalle Bratislava in Slovakia. These came out of my walking, and they are called A Walker's Diary, an effort at disalienation. And I live on Walker's Dairy, so there's a kind of a play on that word. And this effort at disalienation is really opposed to the overseer's supposed subjective act of overseeing everything. And I think the surveillance that happened on the plantation is a kind of a precursor to today's panopticon and the way in which surveillance strategies have been developed. And I think that overseeing, that practice of overseeing, allows for a certain kind of distance from the land, which then promotes the capacity for extractivist practices. And what I'm trying to do is to speak about this more subjective process of inner seeing. The drawings are on daily analysis records. These are papers that I found in an abandoned sugar factory across the valley from where I am. And I'm suggesting that it's also valuable to insert personal information onto these pages, and that this kind of process of inner seeing will hopefully promote a different kind of relationship with our land, one that is about nurturing and caretaking and kind of observing with a certain kind of wonder the multitude of gifts that nature offers and to consider a reciprocal relationship with the ground beneath our feet. The lines that you're looking at are the lines of a topographical map of the site where I live. We are a place that has been mapped for centuries. We are buried under all of these cadastrals and ways of carving up land. And the topographical map felt a little bit different to that. So the drawings now sit on top of this topographical map, and I'll just go through them without speaking. So that has, that's just to give you a sense of how it looks on the wall with the drawings floating on the topographical map. Okay, so the last little bit of the presentation is the reading of a poem by an incredible poet from Jamaica. Her name is Olive Senior. She is their Jamaica Poet Laureate. And the title of her poem is called Rejected Text for a Tourist Brochure. And it was inspired by a Jamaican anthropologist, a phrase called, "I saw my land in the morning and oh, but she was fair." And I've chosen this because I'm trying to shift in this presentation between you know, the sugar plantation and that transition to tourist economy. So I'm closing out with these ideas around tourism. So this is Rejected Text for a Tourist Brochure. Come see my land. Come see my land before the particles of busy fires ascend, before the rivers descend underground, before coffee plantations grind the mountains into dust, before the coral dies, before the beaches disappear. Come see my land, come see my land, and know that she was fair. Up here, the mountains are still clear. After 3 weeks, I heard a solitaire. Down there, the mountains are clear-cut marl pits. Truckers steal sand from beaches, from riverbeds, to build another ganja palace, another shopping center, another hotel. My shares in cement are soaring. The rivers, angry, are sliding underground, leaving pure rock stone and hungry belly. No problem, man, come, we'll be one hell of a beach party. No rain, no cover, no need to bring your bathing suit or umbrella. Come, walk with me in the latest style, rockstone and dry gully. Come for the final closing down sale. Take for a song the last black coral, the last green turtle, the last blue swallowtail preserved behind glass. Come, walk the last mile to see the last manatee, the last coney, the last alligator, the last iguana smile. Oh, them gone already? No problem, man. Come, look the film here. Reggae soundtrack and all. Come see my land. Come see my land and know, A-O, that she was fair. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm open to any comments or questions.